Hey guys, I'm Dave and welcome to the Trull Gallery. Today we're going to make a delicate but sturdy stand for a rain stick. My friend Justin at Ebor Restore Yoga and More has recently gotten into sound baths, and I'll explain that later. But one of the things he got was a rain stick. It's an 8-minute rain stick, and it's kind of tall and it's not very stable. So I decided to make him a stand to support the rain stick. Now I get it. Not everybody has a rain stick at home or even knows what one is. But that's okay because the processes I use in making the stand can be used in any of the projects you're working on yourself. So with that said, let's see how the stand comes together.
I started this project with a couple of scraps of half-inch plywood. One was 7 inches square and the other was 5 inches square. The first thing to do was mark the center by connecting the diagonals. And then using this center point, I added more center lines, this time perpendicular to the sides. I measured in a half-inch from each side on the center lines and marked those locations on both pieces of plywood. I clamped down 2 thicker boards, sandwiching the plywood in between, and used a flexible rule to define my curve. The thicker boards held the ends in place, and I flexed the rule until it just passed the tick mark I had just made. I repeated this on the smaller plywood as well. Over at the bandsaw, I cut just outside my line to define the curve on each of the pieces of plywood. Since I don't own a spindle sander, yet, I chucked up a sanding drum in my drill press. I clamped on an auxiliary table to keep my work perpendicular to the drum while working. A few passes were all that was needed to remove the bandsaw marks and fair the curve. At the table saw, I ripped a piece of 4/4 maple to 7 inches wide. It was about 18 inches long, or just long enough for me to get all the pieces I needed for my stand. Moving to the miter saw, I cut my base to length, leaving me with a 7-inch square. I noticed a large check in the stock that I had planned to use, so I grabbed a few pieces of scrap maple and ripped them to 5 inches in width. Then it was back to the miter saw, where I squared up one end, and then cut the blanks to 5 inches square. A stop block here ensures that the 2 pieces will be the same size with less measuring. Over the years I've made several of these miter sleds, some for corner splines, some for dovetails, but this one will help with the slots for the uprights. It consists of 2 opposing stacks of plywood cut at 45 degrees, giving me a 90-degree cradle to support my work. I centered the 1/4-inch dado set on the line where the 2 sides meet the jig, and then raised the height of the blade to 3/4 of an inch. I clamped the sled to my miter gauge, and then I could cut the groove on each of the 4 corners. I cut the corners on one of the 5-inch squares, and then the 7-inch square. The larger square was a bit harder to hold, but it still cut the grooves I needed cleanly and safely. Using the fence on my table saw to help line things up, I can now use the templates I made earlier to transfer the curve on all 4 sides of both small squares. I repeated the same process with a 7-inch square. Oh, and somewhere before getting to this point, I thought of switching the base to 5/4 stock, as it might give the stand a bit more stability. Back at the bandsaw, I could cut the curves I had just drawn, staying about a 1/16 of an inch on the outside of my lines. A few minutes later, and all 3 blocks were ready for the next step. I set my router table up with a 1/2-inch flush trim bit and used double-stick tape to hold the template in place. I cut the sides one at a time and reset the template. If I was going to build more than one of these stands, I would have probably cut the curves on all 4 sides of the template. Because I stayed close to my line at the bandsaw, I was able to clean things up with just a few light passes. I did have a blowout on the 4th pass of one block. Luckily I found the missing chunk, glued it back in place, and cleaned it up the next day. I had a bit of a challenge with my thicker 7-inch block. The flush trim bit I was using wasn't long enough to clean the entire face in one pass. I cleaned up all 4 sides with the template, then I could reset my bit height and clean up that last bit of stock on the bottom by allowing the bearing to run along the edges I had just trimmed up. Now I can use the first 5-inch square that's no longer square as a template for the second. A couple of strips of double stick tape and I can run all 4 sides without stopping, ensuring that these 2 pieces are the same shape and size. Back at the drill press, I use my sanding drum to clean up any machining or burn marks left by the router. I left the 2 smaller pieces taped together while sanding to ensure things stayed lined up. There was one last thing to do before taking the 2 pieces apart. I used an 1/8-inch brad point bit to drill a center point through both pieces, again ensuring everything would stay in line later. After splitting the 2 small pieces apart, I laid the one without grooved corners on the larger base piece. After centering the 2 pieces, which was easy with all those layout lines, I traced the shape of the small piece onto the larger one. I measured for the mounting screws to ensure that they would sit well outside the large inner hole that I'd soon drill. The hole would be just over 3 inches, so I made the location of the fasteners 2 inches out from the center point. Then I used my awl to define the locations. Back at the drill press, I used that same 1/8-inch brad point bit and drilled from the top through the base in all 4 locations. Then I chucked up a taper bit with a countersink, set the depth to bury the screw head in the base, and then flipped the stock over and drilled up from the bottom this time. I used more double stick tape to hold the 2 pieces together once they were realigned. Then I flipped them over, and using that same taper bit, I pre-drilled into the smaller piece. Once the 4 holes were drilled, I removed the tape and marked one corner of both pieces so I could align them again later. Before going any further, I gave all 3 pieces their initial sanding with my random orbit sander. I started with 120 grit and went as far as 220 grit for now. I notched the bottom of 4 pieces of 1/4-inch plywood for my next template. I taped the plywood pieces into the top and bottom of the stand and checked to make sure that one piece was standing squarely in place. Then I could make a few marks showing me several key locations I'd need for the next step. Again, to get a fair curve, I clamped a block to my table and then clamped my flexible rule to the block. I could then bend the rule until I found a good curve between the 2 points of the template. I tried to use the same setup for the opposite curve, but it didn't come out quite right. So instead I marked several points with a 5/8-inch offset from the first line, and then connected the dots with my rule. This left me with a much better looking shape. I set up my table saw to resaw a couple of scraps of walnut. I made one pass, then flipped the stock end for end, keeping the same face towards the fence, and made the second pass. The 2 pieces I cut down left me with 4 nearly identical strips, just thicker than what I needed. A few passes through my planer and I got a nice snug fit into the grooves of the maple pieces. The last few passes were really light so I could sneak up on the best possible fit. After shaping the leg template, I laid out the shape on each of the 4 walnut strips. There are good white charcoal pencils out there to mark on darker woods, but it's not these pencils. I gave up on that plan and just used a number 2 pencil. I also made sure to work around any defects, knots, or squirrely grain when laying out each piece. After ensuring each of the strips were laid in place correctly, I taped the stack together so I could do all the shaping at once. First was the plumb cut for the bottom piece. I used my tenon jig on the table saw. And rather than move the toggle clamp for just one cut, I used a quick grip clamp to hold things in place. After setting the fence to my layout line, and the blade to just below the height I had marked, I could make my first cut. A few adjustments on the fence and I could make the cut through all 4 pieces. Then I adjusted the blade height until it was right at my mark and made the final cleanup pass. Next, it was back to the miter saw to cut the strips to length. I left them a bit long and I'll clean that up after assembly. At the bandsaw, I made the first cut shaping the 4 legs. Then I added more tape to keep them secure before making the second cut. I kept both of these cuts very close to my layout line, as I didn't want to take these 4 small pieces to the router table. Instead, I took one more trip to the drill press to clean things up with my sanding drum. This does a nice job, but it can leave some humps and bumps along your line. I like to follow that up with some hand sanding. You can feel the imperfections better, and it only takes a few minutes to get a fair curve. I put more tape to hold this side together, and then repeated the sanding process on the opposite side. Before drilling the large hole in the 2 smaller pieces, I pre-drilled the center hole to match the pilot bit on my adjustable hole cutter, in this case 5/16. With that done, I switched over to a weapon of mass destruction, also known as a 2-wing adjustable circle cutter. I've had a 1-wing cutter before, but it died of old age. And I'd say that these things are not really that scary to use, but let's be real. That's a lot to spin, even in a drill press. The key to a 2-wing cutter is to get the 2 cutters equidistant from the center point before starting. I clamped 2 pieces of stock to help hold the small piece in place, then clamped the workpiece down with my T-track hardware. Some things you need to know about these circle cutters. You need to reduce your drill press to its lowest speed, in my case 600 RPM, and make sure you lock down your drill press table to reduce vibration. Cutting is slow going, and you're very likely to create a lot of smoke as you work. And I'm working in 3/4 inch maple. Thinner, soft woods may be less prone to smoking. Also, you want to cut just over halfway from one face, then flip over your stock and cut in from the opposite side. This should prevent any nasty blowouts. I could have purchased a 3¼ inch hole saw, but I might use that once every 5 years. The adjustable feature on this cutter makes it more appealing for multiple size circles. Just make sure you have good ventilation. Oh, and never use this thing in a handheld drill. That would be dangerous as hell. Once both holes were cut, it was back to the sanding drum, and I reset the spindle speed to 2600 RPM. I still use an auxiliary table to keep things square, but this time the piece has to be in place around the drum when you raise the table. A few minutes of work and the rough cuts and burn marks are all cleaned up. I'll still need to do some additional sanding by hand to get this where I want, but you can see how much nicer it looks after a little cleanup sanding. Before I do any further sanding, I ease the inner edges of the small pieces with an 1/8 inch roundover bit in my palm router. This will minimize any scratches as the acrylic tube is placed in and out of the stand. The bottom piece only got a roundover on the top face, while the upper piece got a roundover on both faces. A little more hand sanding was all it was needed to clean up the router marks. After sanding everything to 320 grit with my random orbit sander, it was time to switch to my sanding block. I'm going to use a hand-rubbed oil finish on this, and these look best when you sand to at least 600 grit. I started by using 400 grit wet-dry paper on my sanding block, working all the flat areas. Once that was done, I used the 400 grit paper to get all the curved areas and the roundovers on all the pieces. If you're wondering about the blue tape on the walnut pieces, that's to prevent the areas that will be glued from being polished with these fine grits. If the wood is too smooth, the glue won't hold. And once everything was sanded at 400 grit, I switched to 600 grit and repeated the entire process. If you've never sanded wood to 600 grit before, this is what it can look like. At this grit, and anything higher, you're not really sanding. It's more like burnishing. I'm hoping you can see the light reflecting off this raw maple. I've done the same finish on open grain woods like red oak, and it looks just as impressive. I connected the 2 bottom pieces before adding the legs. 1.5 long, number 8 wood screws lock things together. Using the marks I made earlier, I was able to line things up so I knew which corner went where. Delicate glue-ups like this are a great place to do a dry run on the assembly. Here, I just used blue tape to hold things together and got a feel of what it would take to assemble everything. One thing I noticed is that the legs now felt a little loose in the corner grooves. I planned on using regular PVA wood glue, but I think I'll switch to epoxy. Epoxy can be messy and difficult to clean up. So to keep things neater, I taped off all the areas where the epoxy might squeeze out. I also covered the scrap plywood that I was using as a work surface with packing tape. I knew I'd get squeeze out on the bottom, and this would prevent things from sticking together. Once the epoxy was thoroughly mixed, I could add it to each of the bottom grooves, making sure I got full coverage, but not leaving too much excess. Then I could do the same for the top grooves. The legs were added to the bottom one at a time, and I pressed down to the plywood base and taped it in place. With all the legs in place, I could add the top, this time pressing the top just below the top of the legs, and then I taped them in place as well. This is also a good time to remove as much of the excess epoxy as you can. This will make the final cleanup easier. And as an afterthought, off camera, I did add a few quick grip clamps to pull the opposite corners tight, both top and bottom. I let the epoxy cure overnight and removed all the blue tape. You can clean out any of the residual epoxy with a chisel or a new single-edged razor. I feel like I have more control in tight spaces with a razor blade, and it made quick work of any leftover squeeze-out. I knew there would be more sanding, but what is left is easily accessible, like the top of the legs that protrude just above the maple top. It only took a few minutes with my random overt sander working from 150 grit through 320 grit to clean things up. A little hand sanding with 400 and 600 grit paper, and the top was ready to go. I repeated the sanding process on the legs, making a smooth transition where they met with the top and bottom of the stand. Once I was happy with each connection, I followed with all the sandpaper grits, again finishing with 400 and 600 grit by hand. The last sanding step was to ease all of the sharp edges. I like the square look on this piece, so using 600 grit paper was all it was needed to give the corners a nice feel. This is where the magic happens. All that extra sanding pays off when you put on that first coat of Danish oil. I like to use old t-shirts to apply the oil. On the first coat or two, I'll just flood the piece with oil and let it sit overnight. On subsequent coats, I'll let the oil sit for about 20 minutes and then wipe off any excess oil from the surface. If you don't wipe off the excess, you'll get little cured dots of oil on the surface that'll leave your finish looking spotty. You can easily clean those off with a green scratch pad if you don't get to them in time. I like to use 6 coats and never more than 1 coat per day. On a small project like this, the work goes quickly. Oh, and one more thing. Make sure you lay out your oil-soaked rags out to dry on a flat surface for a few days. If the rags are tossed into a pile, the heat that builds up as the oil dries may cause them to combust. Now, I've never experienced this, but one of my friends did, and boy was he surprised. After applying 6 coats of oil over 6 days, it's finally time to finish this puppy. I like to add a coat or two of paste wax over an oil finish. It's a simple process that adds a bit of protection and a little extra sheen. I apply a coat of wax to the entire piece with a clean cotton rag. Make sure that you cover all the areas, even the tough-to-get spots. And once everything is coated, I let it sit for about 20 minutes. Once the wax has had time to dry, I come back with another clean cotton rag and buff off any excess wax. Again, make sure you get all the nooks and crannies. Once you buff the entire piece, you can stop here, but I like to add a second coat just like the first.
Wax on, wax off.
I also like to let it sit overnight and give it one more wipe down with yet another clean cotton rag.
Despite a couple of setbacks, the stand for the rain stick came out great, and the rain stick is much more stable and is much less likely to fall over during use. Hopefully you got a few tips out of this video that you can use on a project of your own. If you notice some music in the background, that was actually the sound bath I recorded at the yoga studio. And I'm going to add a little bit more of that at the end of the video here. But if you'd like to see more, there's an entire 15-minute or so video that I will add a link to that you can check that out. It's not the same as being there in person, but I think you'll get the idea. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this video. Was there something I could have done safer, smarter, more efficiently? Drop them in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, maybe give us a thumbs up and share it with friends. And if you haven't already, maybe hit that subscribe button and the little bell so you get notified each time I put out a new video. Not sure what's coming out next, but it should be interesting. So with that said, guys, have a great day. Stay safe. We'll see you soon.